Lela Johnston was a loving mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. According to her granddaughter Leslie, Lela was an important part of her life. She visited her grandmother every week and enjoyed getting to spend so much time with her. Lela used her sewing skills to make all of Leslie's school clothes. Lela lived alone in the first floor of a duplex on North Robinson Avenue in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She took a great pride in her home and put a lot of work into caring for it and her yard. On February 29, 1976, 68-year-old Lela retired after working for 20 years for the state of Oklahoma in the state welfare office. Sadly, she did not get to enjoy her retirement for very long. On May 14th of that year, her upstairs neighbor discovered Lela's partially clothed body on the floor of her bedroom. Lela had been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. There was evidence of forced entry at the back of the home. Her family could not fathom how anyone could do this to such a kind woman, especially since nothing had been stolen from the home. Several leads were followed during the investigation, but Lela's family would have to wait several decades for technology to advance to the point where it could solve the case. In 2003, the Oklahoma City Police Department established a cold case unit, and Lela's case was re-examined. In 2004, a DNA profile of the killer was identified from evidence found at the crime scene. However, there were no matches to the profile in any of the criminal databases it was run through. 20 years later, the Cold Case Unit began working with DNA Labs International and genealogist Allison Martin-Krensky in hopes of identifying the killer using genetic genealogy. Multiple branches of a family tree were investigated before the killer was finally identified. On December 5, 2024, the Oklahoma City Police Department announced that Lela's killer had been identified as Charles O. Droke, who had been 28 years old at the time of the murder. Unfortunately, Droke was not alive to be prosecuted. He had been shot in the head and killed by his brother Edwin in 1989. Edwin claimed he had acted in self-defense during an argument with his brother, but was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. However, he killed himself 2 days after his sentencing. Evidence from Charles Droke's own murder was still in police archives, which allowed police to obtain the DNA sample that confirmed that his DNA was a match to that from Lela's crime scene. It was very important to Lela's granddaughter Leslie that her grandmother's murder was solved, even after nearly 50 years. Despite the fact that Droke will never serve time for what he did to her grandmother, Leslie feels as though he has paid for his crimes through his own violent end. She feels an inner peace now that the case is solved. In 1967, 75-year-old Louisa Dunne lived alone on Britannia Road in the eastern area of Bristol, England. In the 1930s, she had been an active member of the community and regularly attended the city's formal and important civil events. Her husband, Teddy Parker, was a city alderman who many believed would go on to become mayor. However, he died in 1945, just as his political career was taking off. Louisa remarried to a night watchman named John Dunne, but was widowed for a second time in the early 1960s. She was a strong, determined woman who did her best to carry on, but after losing her second husband, she never fully recovered and looked quite frail in the final years of her life. Louisa was well known in her neighborhood, even though she was no longer active in local politics. She was regularly seen walking to local shops, dressed in her black velvet coat. On June 27, 1967, Louisa spent the evening at the home of her friend Alice Clark. Alice later told the Bristol Post, "We had a bit of custard and stewed gooseberry. When she left, she said, as she always did, 'Good night, God bless. I don't know when I'll be seeing thee.'" The following day, June 28th, Louisa did not go out as was her routine. One of her neighbors noticed something else unusual. One of Louisa's windows had been left slightly open. Louisa always closed her windows. The neighbor went to Louisa's home to check on her. They found Louisa's body in the front room of her house. Louisa's post-mortem examination showed that she had been strangled and raped. 91 police officers worked on her case, and over 8,000 people were interviewed as a part of the investigation. However, it would be 57 years before an arrest was made in the case. On November 19th, 2024, 92-year-old Ryland Headley of Clarence Road in Ipswich was arrested and charged with Louisa's rape and murder. His arrest came after recent forensic re-examination of the evidence in the case. This may be the oldest cold case arrest ever made in the United Kingdom. Headley would have been in his mid-30s at the time of the murder. He appeared at Bristol Magistrates Court via video link after he was taken into custody for questioning. He was not asked to enter a plea to the charges he faces, and only spoke to confirm his name, date of birth, address, and the fact that he understood that the hearing was taking place as if he was physically present in court. He was not present for a brief hearing at Bristol Crown Court that was held on November 21st. At the hearing, Judge Martin Picton set Headley's trial date for June 16th, 2025. Headley did not enter a bail application and was remanded to custody. Esther Gonzalez grew up as the fourth of 7 children. She was particularly close with her older sister Elizabeth, as they were only 1 year apart in age. Esther was very polite and mild-mannered. While she could be very shy, she was also very funny. On February 9th, 1979, 17-year-old Esther left her parents' home in Beaumont, California, to walk to her sister's house in nearby Banning. She never arrived. The following day, a man called the Riverside County Sheriff's Office to report that he had found a body in a snowbank off of Highway 243, south of Poppet Flats Road. The caller would later be described as argumentative. He claimed he could not tell if the body was that of a man or a woman. It was the body of Esther Gonzalez. Her autopsy would show that she had been raped and then bludgeoned to death. Investigators believed she had been attacked at some point during her walk to her sister's house. 5 days after Esther's body was found, the sheriff's office was able to identify the man who had discovered her body as Louis Randolph Randy Williamson. They contacted him and asked him to take a polygraph examination, which he agreed to do. He passed the exam and was cleared of any wrongdoing. No arrests were made at the time. The case was periodically revisited over the years, but no major breakthroughs came until decades after Esther was killed, when semen was identified in her underwear, which had been preserved in evidence, and a DNA profile was developed from it. The profile was entered into the combined DNA index system, but no matches were found. In 2023, the cold case homicide team turned to genetic genealogy as a potential means for solving the case, and began working with Othram Inc. in Texas. A potential relative of the killer who was identified by this effort was a woman who had died in Beaumont, the town where Esther's parents lived. In early 2024, a crime analyst assigned to the case looked at a newspaper article regarding this woman and her death, and saw a familiar name. The woman's son was listed as the executor of her will. His name was Louis Randolph Williamson, the same name as the man who had discovered Esther's body. While Williamson had been cleared based on the results of the polygraph, he had never been cleared by DNA. It does not appear that Williamson was ever convicted of any crimes, although he did have some allegations of assault in his history. After 1979, he had served in the Marine Corps and then lived, as far as investigators could tell, a very ordinary life. He died in Florida in 2014. Once genetic genealogy tied Williamson to the crime for a second time, investigators focused in on him and obtaining a sample of his DNA. They could not obtain one from him directly because of his death, but they learned that a sample of his blood had been taken during his autopsy and preserved. It was sent to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing. On November 20th, 2024, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office announced that they had identified Williamson as Esther's rapist and murderer after it was confirmed that his DNA was a match to the DNA found on Esther's body. After the announcement, Esther's oldest brother Eddie wrote in a Facebook post, "The Gonzalez family would like to thank the Riverside County Sheriff's Department on a job well done. After 40 years, the Gonzalez family has closure." In an email to CNN, Esther's sister Elizabeth said that she is happy to have closure, although she is somewhat sad that Williamson is dead and cannot serve any time in prison. Michelle Miller served her country as a soldier in the United States Army. By 1992, however, 29-year-old Michelle had fallen on hard times. She had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who she absolutely adored. However, her love for them was cruelly being used against her. She was trapped in an abusive relationship with her jealous and violent partner, the children's father, because he threatened to take custody of the children should she try to leave him. After a lengthy period of abuse, Michelle did make plans to take measures to protect herself. On July 27, 1992, she told her social worker that she planned to file for a restraining order against her partner. The following day, Michelle was seen at the Prospect Buffet in the Central Square neighborhood of Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was never seen alive again. 2 weeks later, police received a complaint about a foul odor emanating from 245 Washington Street. In the building's filthy basement, police discovered the body of Michelle Miller. She was partially clothed, and her face had been covered with a blanket. It would be more than 32 years before an arrest was made in Michelle's case. On December 16, 2024, Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan and Cambridge Police Commissioner Christine Illau announced that 65-year-old Edward J. Watson had been arrested for Michelle's murder. They allege that Michelle was killed in a murder-for-hire plot, and that Watson killed her at the behest of his associate and her abusive partner, Daniel J. Innes. Innes cannot be charged in the case because he died in 2012 after being sentenced to 15 to 20 years in state prison for an unrelated manslaughter. Watson has at least 13 felony convictions, and a former girlfriend has previously gotten a restraining order against him. During the initial investigation, he had been identified as someone who had seen Michelle on the night she was last seen alive, but he was not considered a suspect at the time. Watson was interviewed at least 3 times during a recent review of Michelle's murder by cold case investigators. During his 3rd interview, Watson allegedly made incriminating statements. Watson was arraigned in Cambridge District Court on December 16th. During the hearing, prosecutor David Sollett elaborated on the statements Watson had made about Michelle's murder. He told the court, in a 3rd interview, Watson admitted for the first time that he had been in the abandoned apartment at the time of her death. and, in fact, that he had struck her, first explaining that he did it with his fists, and then saying he did it with a stick or a board, and that while there were other men in the apartment prior to her death, that he was alone with her at the time that he struck those blows, and that those blows killed her. A plea of not guilty was entered on Watson's behalf at the hearing. He is next due back in court on February 11th, 2025. District Attorney Ryan has spoken with Michelle's two now adult children to inform them of the arrest and the fact that their father is believed to have orchestrated their mother's murder. She has stated, "It was very bittersweet information. On the one hand, realizing that police had never given up in the search for what happened to their mother, but then learning that the person who was their biological father is alleged to have been the person who set that in motion." Family was very important to Byron Carr. He and his brother John were very close in age, which helped them have a strong bond, and he remained close with his parents, especially his mother, into adulthood. He also had lots of friends and enjoyed traveling. Byron was a well-liked English teacher at Montague Regional High School. According to some of his former students, he had a heart of gold and remained interested in the lives of his students long after they completed his class. In 1988, 36-year-old Byron was living in a house on Lapthorne Avenue in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, which he took great pride in and kept very neat. It would be in this house where Byron was killed on November 11th, 1988. He was strangled with a towel, and his body had later been stabbed several times. The killer had written, "I will kill again" on Byron's wall, which obviously raised concerns that more victims would follow. Byron's wallet was also missing. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and police believed Byron and the killer had consensual sex prior to his murder. Byron was gay, but kept his sexuality private to avoid the discrimination so many others dealt with at the time. He had not even come out to his parents, despite how close they were. His murder led to him being publicly outed. Decades later, investigators would say that Byron's sexuality led to a lack of public interest and cooperation in the case. Byron's family felt this was the case as well. In 2024, Byron's brother John would say, "People were afraid for their jobs just because they were gay at the time. Being gay wasn't a great thing back in 1988 in the public eye. I can remember public officials that were very lukewarm to taking part in the investigation." Other members of the LGBTQ community in the area feared that they may be targeted by the killer as well, and the wider community's cold response to the murder of a gay man only added to their fears that they were not safe on Prince Edward Island. Jeffrey Haight is one of Byron's former students, and a gay man who left Prince Edward Island for many years because he felt safer living in a big city. In 2024, he spoke to the CBC about Byron and his murder, saying, "Why was this situation created? Well, it was because society didn't let us be us, and we had to live in the shadows. And when you live in the shadows, you meet certain people you should not be around." Police believed the killer was bisexual, a conclusion they came to following the examination of the most important piece of evidence they had, the killer's underwear, which had been left behind at the scene. Police cut out a section from the front of the underwear to test it for DNA, and found both male and female DNA, believed to be from the owner of the underwear and a woman he had sex with. The size of the underwear indicated that the killer had a small build, as it fit very tightly when displayed on a mannequin with a 29.5-inch waist. Despite the societal unease around Byron's sexuality and murder, police did preserve evidence and investigate the crime. Hundreds of interviews were conducted over the ensuing decades. Police went to see Byron's parents every few years about the investigation, even though they rarely had substantial progress to report. Byron's case was formally reopened in October of 2007. Investigators hoped that since the LGBTQ community was becoming more accepted, witnesses who may have been scared to come forward in 1988 because it would involve disclosing their own sexuality would now be willing to speak with them. The Charlottetown Police Service also released a composite image of a suspect who attacked a gay man in Charlottetown just 2 months after Byron was killed, and was considered a person of interest in the murder. The case would remain unsolved until 2024. That January 26th, Chief Brad McConnell announced that the day before, 56-year-old Todd Joseph Gallant, also known as Todd Joseph Irving, had been arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of interfering with human remains in connection with Byron's murder. A second person had also been arrested but then released, although their potential involvement in the case is still being investigated. Police had long believed that at least one other man had come back with the killer to try to remove incriminating evidence from Byron's house after he was killed. In 2013, they revealed that 2 unconnected witnesses had come forward saying that a man had confessed to them that the killer had taken him back to Byron's house after the murder to get rid of evidence. The 2 witnesses came forward in 2008 and 2012 and knew details that had not been made public. The individual they reported, whose name has not been released, had been released on parole shortly before Byron was killed, had a violent criminal history, and had been a potential suspect in the murder early on in the investigation. However, he had passed away in the early 2000s, and as such, could not be interviewed about who brought him to Byron's house that night. Police believed that it was when the killer brought his accomplice to the scene hours after Byron was strangled with the towel, that Byron was stabbed, the note was written on the wall, and Byron's wallet was stolen. These actions were taken to confuse police. Socks had been found in Byron's kitchen trash can. Police believed that someone had worn them on their hands in the house so that they would not leave behind any fingerprints. DNA was extracted from the inside of one of the socks, but it did not match the DNA on the underwear or the deceased reported accomplice. As such, a third individual may have been involved in the attempted cleanup and tampering with the crime scene after the murder occurred. Gallant had only been 21 years old at the time of Byron's murder. He had been living in Charlottetown in 1988, but moved to the United States after Byron was killed. He lived in Texas and Arkansas before moving back to Prince Edward Island in 2022. He was convicted of breaking and entering in Canada in 1987 and had a criminal record in the United States as well. He had been identified using genetic genealogy. Charlottetown police worked with Wyndham Forensics Group and Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy to identify him as the contributor of the DNA at the crime scene, after familial matches to it were found in the family tree DNA and GEDmatch databases. Gallant's lawyer, Chris Montigny, appeared in court on Gallant's behalf on February 1st. The case was adjourned until the following month to give Montigny time to review the large amount of evidence and documents in the case. He does not yet know how his client will plead to the charges he is facing. On the day Byron was buried, his mother turned to her son John and told him, "It's not really over until we know what happened and why." It was never over for her, or for Byron's father, as they both passed away a few years before charges were brought in their son's case. Byron's brother John was still alive to see Gallant's arrest and was present at the press conference announcing it. He thanked police for all of their hard work and said of the arrest finally being made, "It's like a weight being lifted off you. It's hard to describe. It's just kind of a release." Carol Barrett grew up as one of 6 children on McIntyre Street in Zanesville, Ohio. She had a cheerful and spunky personality. She liked to make up her mind on her own and wasn't afraid to say what she thought. She was somewhat of a tomboy and regularly wrestled with her 3 brothers on the family's living room floor. In high school, she was a member of the concert band, the marching band, and the school radio station staff. Carol was very brave. In the summer of 1978, she jumped into the water to save her 2-year-old niece from drowning. That same year, Carol and her family went on vacation to Florida. Carol loved her time there and heard a lot about how much fun spring break was in the area. She begged her parents to let her go back to Florida for spring break the following spring, when she would be a senior in high school, but they did not allow it. Carol graduated in 1979 and went to work at a Wendy's restaurant with the goal of saving enough money to go to Florida the following spring. Not all of her money went to her trip savings, however. She used some of it to buy sheets and glassware and towels when she had the chance. She put the various home goods she was able to acquire in her hope chest, saving them for when she married her high school sweetheart, Tom, who had joined the Navy. When Carol wanted to go to Florida with her friends from high school in the spring of 1980, her parents finally allowed her to go. Carol began the drive to Daytona Beach shores on March 20th, with her large group of friends split between two vehicles. They drove throughout the night, taking turns driving. When they arrived in Daytona Beach shores, they checked into their rooms at the Treasure Island Motel. The girls were staying in room 617, and the boys were a floor below them in room 521. The group was hanging out in the girls' room that Saturday night. Shortly after 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, March 23rd, Carol and her friend Steve left the room to go walk around. On their way to the elevator, a man blocked their path. He pointed a pistol at them and told them that they were going to turn around and go back to their room. Steve told him that they did not have a key, but the man pointed the gun at Steve's face, and the three of them walked back to room 617. They knocked on the door and were led inside. The assailant followed Steve and Carol into the room and told all 8 people there at the time that he wanted their money. He made everyone undress and line up against the sliding glass door to the balcony. He spent about 45 minutes going through everyone's belongings and eventually pocketed approximately $200. Throughout that time, he periodically clicked his gun, according to one of Carol's friends. He seemed nervous over the fact that there was such a large group of people in the room. He touched them all with the barrel of his pistol to intimidate them. The assailant told the group that he would be taking one of them with him to ensure that no one called the police. He originally grabbed Carol's friend Pam, but grew frustrated when she panicked and began to sob. Carol volunteered to go in her place. She calmly did as he told her and collected her clothes. He forced the others in the room out onto the balcony and told them to stay there until 4 a.m. He would let Carol go if they did not call the police. He locked the sliding glass door and forced Carol out of the hotel room in front of him. Carol's friends did not listen to the instructions and quickly tried to get her help. Carol's friend Chris was able to climb around the block wall separating their balcony from the neighboring one and wake up the people sleeping inside that room. They called the police, but the assailant had a 20-minute head start before they arrived. On Monday morning, a passerby discovered Carol's body in a ditch line along I-95 near Jacksonville International Airport. Her white sweater had been pulled up over her head. She had been shot execution style, according to police. There were no other marks indicating that there had been any kind of struggle. 2 of Carol's friends identified her body, which was returned to Ohio and buried in the Mount Olive Cemetery. Carol's friends helped develop a sketch of what the killer looked like. He had reddish-brown hair, which was parted down the middle, a beard and mustache, a mole on his left cheek, and a long, straight nose. He wore tinted, wire-rimmed glasses. Unfortunately, despite the numerous eyewitnesses to Carol's abduction, her killer was not identified, and the case went cold. In August of 2017, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reviewed the evidence in Carol's case and determined that there was enough to reopen the case. A palm print they had not been able to account for had been preserved in evidence and seemed like a clue that could tie a suspect to the murder. The case would not be closed until January of 2024. On January 25th, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office announced that the investigation had come to an end after more than 40 years. As with many other cold cases solved after decades, the identification of Carol's killer would not result in a trial. However, while most of these cases never go to court because a suspect died before their identification, in Carol's case, The man who confessed to her murder was still alive, but already serving life in prison. That man was serial killer Billy Mansfield Jr. Mansfield had an extensive history of sexual crimes. His crimes eventually progressed to murder, with him killing 3 young women and 2 teenage girls. He killed 4 of his victims in Florida and buried their bodies in his backyard. He then went to California, where he killed a 5th woman. He pled guilty to the California murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He also pled guilty to the 4 murders he committed in Florida to avoid being extradited there and facing the death penalty. He remains incarcerated in California and is speaking with investigators in various jurisdictions about additional cold cases. Mansfield was identified as a potential suspect in Carol's murder in 2020. He was interviewed by investigators multiple times over the following 2 years. In September of 2022, he acknowledged that he was the man depicted in the composite sketch. He later confessed to abducting Carol and to killing her. Investigators continued working on the case and consulted with the state attorney's office in the 4th Judicial Circuit about how to proceed. In January of 2024, it was decided to close Carol's case, but not pursue prosecuting Mansfield for her murder, since he is incarcerated and has no chance of ever being released, as he would have to serve 4 concurrent life sentences in Florida, even if he were somehow released from his life sentence in California. Carol's parents, one of her sisters, and 2 of her brothers passed away before her case was closed. Her surviving family is grateful for the answers they have received. Carol's niece, Claire Gilligan, is ecstatic that the case is solved and relieved that her aunt's killer has been incarcerated since 1982, which prevented him from killing even more people. Bert Allen Mann loved history from an early age, with a particular focus on the history of the American Civil War. He also loved classical music and opera. He grew up in Graham, Texas, and attended the University of Texas in Austin, where he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology. He also served with the U.S. Marines as a Navy corpsman in Vietnam. In 1994, 46-year-old Bert and his wife Dawn lived in the 2500 block of Stargrass Circle in South Austin, Texas. On May 12th of that year, Dawn came home to discover her husband's body lying on their floor. It appeared that a burglar had forced his way into their home through a back door, and Bert had arrived home from work while he was still inside. A struggle began near the front door, and Bert was ultimately stabbed several times. Police found the crime unusual because individuals who commit property crimes like burglary typically flee when discovered, rather than attack. The break-in and murder also occurred in the middle of the afternoon, when children would be coming home from school and adults would be arriving home from work. More than 20 detectives worked on the case over the ensuing years. Following the establishment of the Austin Police Department's Cold Case Unit in 2005, a blood stain that had been preserved from the crime scene was sent to the lab to test for DNA. The killer had apparently been injured as Bert tried to fight him off, and his blood had been left inside the house after he fled. A DNA profile was successfully developed from the blood stain, but no match to it was found in the combined DNA index system. In March of 2023, the unknown profile was sent to Bode Technology in hopes that they could use genetic genealogy to identify a suspect. In June of that year, they did just that. The man they believed could have been Bert's killer had never been a suspect in the case. The potential suspect was a man named Kenneth Wayne Robbins, who was living in Lubbock, Texas, and working as a long-haul truck driver. Investigators made attempts to surreptitiously collect items thrown away by Robbins to test them for DNA, but they were unsuccessful. Therefore, on September 8, 2023, detectives from Austin traveled to Lubbock with a search warrant to collect a DNA sample from Robbins. They served him with it at his work and collected the sample. He refused to speak with them. 5 days later, the Austin Police Department was contacted by Robbins' employer, who was obviously aware that the department had an interest in him. They reported that the GPS tracker in their truck that Robbins was driving at the time showed that it had been parked at a truck stop in Weatherford, Texas, and had not moved in what they considered to be a suspiciously long amount of time. Police in Austin contacted their counterparts in Weatherford and asked them to perform a welfare check. When they arrived at the truck, they found Robbins dead inside of it. His autopsy would find that he had committed suicide. On February 8, 2024, the Austin Police Department announced that they had identified Robbins as the sole person responsible for Bert's murder. The DNA sample taken from him was a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and had he not taken his own life, he would have been charged with capital murder. Not everyone in Bert's family lived to see his alleged killer identified. His father passed away in 2019, and his mother, Virginia, died just a year before the case was closed. Bert's widow and younger sister did finally learn who took Bert from them. We don't have that big question hanging over our hearts. I had really kind of given up hope that it would happen, and I'm so grateful, his sister, Kathy May, told KVUE News. She is relieved that she does not have to go through the stress of a trial, but is upset over what Robbins' family members must be going through in light of the news of his crime and his death. Stephen Davis was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1952 and moved to Pensacola, Florida the following year. He graduated from high school there in 1970 and later attended Pensacola Junior College, graduating in 1985. Stephen never married or had children, but he was very close with his family, including his mother and two sisters, and visited them frequently. He was very friendly and willing to help any and everyone. He had a lot of compassion for others and helped numerous people quit using drugs. He liked spending time with people, which led to him becoming a cab driver. Just before 4 a.m. on August 26, 1998, Stephen had just finished a 12-hour shift driving his cab. He pulled into the parking lot of a Winn-Dixie grocery store on Navy Boulevard in Pensacola. As he was getting ready to leave, someone came up to his cab and shot Stephen 3 times, striking him once in the jaw and twice in the back. Stephen got out of the vehicle, tried to call for help, and collapsed. He died where he fell. Stephen's yellow station wagon was taken and then later recovered nearby. The driver's window had been shattered, and the driver's door and the rear passenger door were left open. Police found a single fingerprint in a globule of Stephen's blood at the scene, but were not able to match it at the time because they were not able to see the print in clear enough detail. They tried examining it multiple times over the years, and investigators held multiple cold case symposiums before technology advanced to the point where the fingerprint could be properly examined and identified. On March 5, 2024, Escambia County Sheriff Chip Simmons announced that 44-year-old Donald Holmes II is being charged with Stephen's murder after his fingerprint was matched to the one found at the crime scene. Holmes is currently incarcerated at Mayo Correctional Institution Annex in Mayo, Florida. He is serving a 20-year sentence after being found guilty of robbery, fleeing and eluding, and aggravated assault in 2014. He had previously served 17 months in prison for felony fleeing and eluding law enforcement. He was previously set for release on July 31st, 2032, but could receive life without parole if he is convicted of Stephen's murder. He was just 18 years old at the time of Stephen's murder. Stephen's mother, June Wilburn, passed away in 2007 without ever learning who killed her son. His sisters, Ruby Kastner and Julie MacArthur, were both present at the press conference announcing that Holmes is being charged with their brother's murder. "24-year-old Kelly Workman was over 6 feet tall and had a slight but athletic frame. She kept very close to home, very rarely straying too far from her family's dairy farm in rural Douglas County, Missouri. According to Kelly's family, She was extremely shy, naive, and had trouble socializing. In recent years, now that the disorder is more widely understood, they have come to believe that Kelle may have had some form of autistic spectrum disorder. She was very reliant on her parents and never moved out of their home. Kelle did not smile very often, both because she was shy and because she was self-conscious over her crooked front tooth. Kelle was wary of people she did not know, but enjoyed helping others, so long as she was familiar with them. Kelle was hardworking and meticulous, and independent enough to work outside of the house. She worked Sundays at a small country store, and she did yard work and cleaned houses for various family friends who lived in the small community of Dogwood. On the evening of June 30th, 1989, Kelle was mowing the lawn at the Dogwood Cemetery near the Pleasant Southern Baptist Church. This job had been passed down through several generations of her family, and Kelle had performed it for the past 3 years. She took the job very seriously, spending 2 days at a time making sure the grass around each grave marker was trimmed perfectly. Kelle's grandparents and her baby brother were all buried at the cemetery. Kelle was last seen alive at 5:40, when her uncle saw her working in the graveyard as he drove past it. At 6:15, someone who lived nearby found the lawnmower Kelle had been using unattended in the cemetery. Only a third of the grass had been mowed. There was no sign of Kelle. Kelle's parents were immediately alarmed. It was obvious that Kelle had not left the cemetery alone or on her own accord. Kelle's car was still in the parking lot with its keys in the ignition. Her purse with $100 in cash was at home. Kelle was very wary of strangers. She did not even like talking to motorists who pulled off of the highway to ask for directions at the church. She would not have willingly left the cemetery with anyone she did not know. The search for Kelle therefore began that evening, with 50 people quickly joining the effort, searching for her on foot, on horseback, and by helicopter. Extensive searches continued for nearly a week. Then, on July 7th, Kelle's body was discovered in a creek in the Mark Twain National Forest near Oldfield, more than 10 miles away from where she was last seen. 2 of Kelle's uncles were with the search party that located her body, and even decades later, they cannot bring themselves to talk about the experience. Investigators believe that Kelle was killed on the night of her disappearance, June 30th, or early in the morning of July 1st. However, since her body had been submerged in water and temperatures had been so warm, her remains had decomposed very quickly, making it difficult to see any injuries or conclusively determine her cause of death. She also had to be identified by her dental records. More than 400 people came to Kelle's funeral, with 300 of them crammed into the wooden pews of the funeral chapel, and 100 others who could not fit inside, sitting or standing in the lobby for the service. Kelle was then buried at the cemetery where she had last been seen alive. On February 21st, 2024, the Douglas County Sheriff's Department and Christian County Sheriff's Department had a press conference at the church near that cemetery. There, they announced that 3 men, Bobby Lee Banks, Leonard Dwight Banks, and Wiley Belt, had been arrested after being indicted on charges of first-degree murder, forcible rape, and first-degree kidnapping in connection to Kelle's case. According to Douglas County prosecuting attorney Matthew Weatherman, the arrests were finally made after a witness came forward with rock-solid testimony that tied their case together. While it took nearly 35 years for the arrests to be made, at least 2 of the accused, the Banks brothers, were identified in the investigation within a year of Kelle's murder. Recent statements from prosecutors indicate that the 3rd man who has been indicted, Wiley Belt, was also a top suspect early on, despite a lack of media coverage over the investigation into him. Dwight Banks took and passed a polygraph in the summer of 1990. Around that same time, an ex-girlfriend of Bobby Banks told police that he had asked her to falsely provide an alibi for him for the night of Kelle Workman's murder, as he did not have one. Bobby took a polygraph administered by the Missouri State Highway Patrol and failed it. In July of 1995, a local newspaper published an article on the case, which resulted in police receiving a tip and the investigation picking up again. That same month, Dwight Banks gave an interview to that local paper. He gave his own account of the evening of June 30th, 1989, and acknowledged that he had been questioned by police. He also said that on multiple occasions, he had made jokes about Kelle's murder while he was drunk. In 1999, police obtained warrants to collect DNA samples from 2 suspects, one of whom was Dwight Banks. They had hoped that DNA could be identified from the crime scene evidence and be compared to these samples, but nothing ever came of this avenue of investigation. All 3 of the accused have filed for a change of venue for their trials. This has been granted for Dwight Banks and Wiley Belt. Bobby Banks' motion is still to be heard in court. All 3 were initially held on $250,000 cash bond. Wiley Belt's lawyers successfully had this converted to a personal surety bond, and he was able to secure his release from custody while he awaits trial. He is currently under house arrest with GPS monitoring. Dwight Banks is attempting to also secure pre-trial release on the basis of his medical needs. Belt is next due in court on June 4th, and the Banks brothers both have motion hearings scheduled for April 17th. "31-year-old Valerie Ames loved spending time outdoors, mainly camping and riding horses. She loved her 2 young daughters, Pamela and Michelle, even more. The last memory Michelle has of her mother was sitting on her lap at her 5th birthday party, a Barney the Dinosaur-themed celebration. Michelle and 9-year-old Pamela then went on a trip to England with their grandmother and never saw their mother again. Valerie's body was discovered on August 10th, 1996, in a pool of blood. She had been beaten and stabbed to death. Her body was found inside of an apartment at the Courtyard Apartments on King Street in Jacksonville, Florida. However, it was not Valerie's apartment. The man who lived there had been arrested the previous night. His daughter had come to check on his apartment and discovered Valerie's body. Since the resident of the apartment was in police custody at the time of the murder, he was cleared as a suspect. He had no connection to Valerie and did not recognize her when he was shown a picture of her. Valerie lived in the suburban neighborhood of Arlington and did not have a car. There was no known reason for her to have been in that area of Jacksonville, or obvious means by which she had gotten there, indicating that her killer had brought her to the temporarily vacant apartment, which had been left unlocked following its occupant's arrest. One of Valerie's daughters told investigators that 3 months before her mother was killed, she had reported being assaulted by a police officer. Nothing ever came of the charge, and nothing ever came of the lead. Valerie's case went cold. Her daughters grew up, and Valerie eventually had 6 grandchildren who never got the chance to meet her. On April 2nd, 2024, just over 10,000 days after Valerie was killed, Jacksonville Sheriff T.K. Waters announced that 69-year-old Jerry Phillips of North Carolina had been arrested and was being accused of second-degree murder and sexual battery in connection with Valerie's case. He was facing prosecution by the Florida State Attorney's Office. Because of the ongoing criminal proceedings, the sheriff's office is unable to release many details about how Phillips came to be identified. According to State Attorney Melissa Nelson, more information will be made available to the media once Phillips has been indicted and their evidence against him has been formally filed in discovery, making it available to Phillips' attorneys. Sheriff Waters did say that the identification was made due to both the dedicated investigative efforts of the detectives in the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, as well as advances in technology. He also stated that Phillips was not a total stranger to Valerie, although he could not comment on how exactly she knew him. Valerie's mother, June, was still alive to see the arrest made in her daughter's case, and sent a statement to be read at the press conference where it was announced. Valerie's daughter, Michelle, was present at the press conference and gave a statement that said in part, "These long years have done nothing to numb the pain of her non-existence. her pain, and her torture have all become our pain and torture daily. Standing here today, almost 28 years later, we now have some answers on our beautiful mother Valerie, and she has finally reached her chance to have justice. May our mom finally rest in peace. November of 1966 was a time of new beginnings for 18-year-old Karen Snider. She and her husband Paul had welcomed their first child, a daughter named Paula, just 2.5 months earlier. This exciting time was abruptly cut short on November 12, 1966. Paul had been working a double shift that evening. He had tried calling Karen, but she did not answer the phone. He eventually grew nervous because he still could not reach her, so he left work to go check on her. He arrived at his family's home in the 400 block of Wilson Avenue in Calumet City, Illinois, just after 11 p.m. He was immediately concerned because the lights were off and the blinds had never been closed, which was unusual for that time of night. When he went inside, Paul discovered his wife's dead body in their bedroom. Her clothes were in disarray, and she had been stabbed 125 times. It was later estimated that she had been killed 6 hours before her body was found. Baby Paula was in her bassinet in the living room and was unharmed. Police could not find any usable fingerprints at the scene. They hoped that tests on blood smears found on a basement window might provide more information, but this effort did not solve the crime. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, potentially indicating that Karen knew her killer and had willingly let him inside her home. According to Paul and Karen's daughter Paula, her father fought to solve her mother's case from the day she was killed right up until the day he passed away. She says he suffered greatly, not only because he lost his wife, but also because police had initially believed he was their prime suspect. He was questioned numerous times, underwent 4 polygraph examinations, and gave samples of his hair and blood. His blood type was not a match to either of the 2 blood types found on the bloody bedsheets and clothing from the crime scene. Paula believes her father's early death in 1989 at the age of 45 was a result of the stress caused by her mother's murder and the lack of justice for her, even though Paul was almost positive that he knew who the killer was. Paul would finally be proven correct almost 35 years after his death, when, on April 29, 2024, 79-year-old James Barbier was taken into custody at his home outside of St. Louis, to be taken to Illinois to be charged with Karen Snider's murder. Barbier was no stranger to the Sniders or to police. He had been friends with Karen and Paul, and had been one of Paul's co-workers at a local railroad. He had even been a pallbearer at Karen's funeral. During an interview with police after he was taken into custody in 2024, Barbier allegedly told them that he knew this day would eventually come. Barbier had been an early suspect in the case. According to his wife, he had appeared nervous when he had returned home on the evening of Karen's murder. He had arrived later than expected, making him late for his own anniversary party, which was being thrown that evening. He immediately took off his clothes and put them in the washing machine. His wife saw that he had a head wound and multiple cuts on his hands. He also had blood on him. He claimed he had gone to a few taverns and then tripped over a tree stump on his way out of the last one, necessitating a trip to a local clinic. The cuts she saw that night were still visible and observed by others when Barbier attended Karen's funeral a few days later. He was arrested for the murder in late 1966, but police had to release him because they did not have enough evidence to charge him. Karen's daughter, now Paula Larson, had approached the Calumet City Police in 2009 trying to get them to reopen her mother's case. The effort left her feeling defeated. The detective she spoke with, who has since retired, told her the evidence was unavailable, and Paula was left feeling as though she had no other means of getting the case solved. It would be a call from someone far more distantly connected to Karen that finally launched the effort that would ultimately lead to Barbier's arrest. Kevin Seeley is a fourth cousin of Paula Snider Larson, who had never met her prior to the press conference announcing Barbier's arrest. Growing up, he had heard the story of Karen's murder from his grandmother, Dee. Dee's husband was one of Paul Snider's cousins. She would tell her grandson about the tragic death of a poor young woman, and how it still troubled her, even decades later. In December of 2022, Kevin contacted the police in Calumet City to inquire about the case. This time, the detective he was able to get in contact with was far more thorough in looking into the cold case. Calumet City detectives learned about Barbier after reviewing the case file and obtained a warrant for his DNA. They traveled to Missouri to serve it in April of 2023 and also interviewed Barbier for over an hour and a half. He told them the same story about his activities that night that he had given in 1966. A DNA profile was then developed from one of the pieces of clothing Karen had been wearing when she was killed, and found to be a match to Barbier, which led to his arrest. Because of his age and poor health, Barbier is not in custody, as a legal case against him proceeds. He is under order not to leave Missouri or Illinois, had to surrender his passport and firearms, and is required to report to authorities in person and by phone twice a month. Karen's family is understandably upset that he is not still in custody. Judy Weaver was born and raised in Everett, Washington. At 17, she was the winner of a local beauty pageant. In 1984, 42-year-old Judy was the co-owner of the Bell Nest Cafe on Hewitt Avenue in Everett. She had two grown daughters, Kathy, who lived in Washington, and Colleen, who was living in North Pole, Alaska. Kathy, as well as Judy's mother Edith, worked at the cafe with her. Judy had recently become a grandmother and displayed signs reading, "It's a boy," all over her cafe to proudly announce her grandson Levi's birth. On the evening of June 1st, 1984, the local Salty Sea Days Festival was ending in Everett. Judy left the Bell Nest to walk home after work. A witness saw her at the Dairy Queen half a block away from her apartment. She regularly stopped there to buy vanilla ice cream on her way home from work. The Dairy Queen would be the last place Judy was seen alive. Just after midnight on June 2nd, a passerby used a payphone to call 911 to report a fire at the one-story, 5-unit brick apartment building on the corner of 35th Street and Rucker Avenue. Smoke was pouring out of one of the apartments, Judy's. When the firefighters were able to enter the unit, they were horrified to find Judy's dead body. She had been tied up, bound with foam cord, pantyhose, and fabric. Judy had been strangled to death, and her clothes had been cut away with a knife. The fire had been contained to her bedroom, and firefighters determined that it had been started on Judy's bed, using paper towels and a jar of Pond's cold cream. The apartment's back door was unlocked. The case remained unsolved for decades. It was reopened by investigators in 2002. A suspect was identified at the time, but further investigation cleared him. It would not be until May 1st, 2024, almost 40 years after Judy was killed, that an arrest was made in her case. That day, 66-year-old Mitchell Gaff was taken into custody in Olympia, Washington, to face charges of first-degree murder, first-degree arson, first-degree burglary, first-degree rape, and first-degree kidnapping in connection to Judy's case. Gaff was identified using DNA evidence. In 2023, a fabric ligature that had been used to tie Judy's hands had been re-examined. A DNA profile was found, and after it was run through the combined DNA index system, Gaff was identified as a potential match. Another sample was necessary to confirm the match. Therefore, undercover police officers surreptitiously collected discarded items that contained Gaff's saliva. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab then matched the DNA sample to samples from a vaginal swab taken during Judy's autopsy, 3 pieces of clothing she was wearing on the night of her murder, and from the ligatures used to bind and strangle her. Gaff, who has been diagnosed by state therapists as a sexual sadist, had his DNA profile in the system because he has an extensive history of sexually based offenses and has spent decades under state-mandated confinement. At the time of his arrest for Judy's murder, he was living independently, but registered as a level 3 sex offender. Gaff's known criminal behavior began in 1979, when he attacked a woman as she was putting away her lawnmower. He forced her to the ground, bound her hands, hit her repeatedly with a pistol, and threatened to cut her throat. She bravely fought him off and was able to escape before he could rape her. Gaff was convicted of assault and burglary. He received probation for this attack. At the time of Judy's murder, 26-year-old Gaff was living with his parents in Everett and working as a carpet cleaner. 2 months after Judy was killed, he broke into a house at night and attacked 2 teenage sisters. He bound and violently raped them in front of one another before one sister was able to escape and get help. He pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree rape and first-degree burglary and was sentenced in 1985. Gaff was scheduled to be released from prison in 1994, but just before he was, prosecutors moved to have him legally detained under the state's sexual predator law. In 1995, a jury found that he should be committed to the state's Special Commitment Center on McNeil Island for treatment. Another jury made the same finding again in 2000. During these trials and during his commitment, Gaff confessed to 5 other rapes and to attempting to attack up to 30 women a day for a period of time. He also claimed that this behavior escalated in the summer of 1984, when Judy was murdered, and that he enjoyed using a knife to cut off his victims' clothes, as Judy's clothes had been removed. Various attempts were made to transition Gaff back into society during the early 2000s, but his violations of the conditions he was under would result in him remaining committed. He was not unconditionally released until 2018, at which point he legally changed his name. Gaff is currently being held without bail. Mary Jane Croft was born on November 19, 1911, in Montana, West Virginia, the 4th of her parents' eventual 8 children. When she was 17, she became Mary Jane Vangilder when she married her husband James. Mary Jane would give birth to 7 children, although only 5 of them survived their births. Twins Alan and Alice were stillborn in 1935. The family lived on a farm along Prickett's Creek outside of Fairmont, West Virginia. By 1943, the Vangilders' marriage appears to have deteriorated. Early that year, Mary Jane moved out of the family home and into an apartment in Fairmont, above the Fairmont Theater. There have been reports that James was abusive towards Mary Jane, but confirming these reports is difficult due to the passage of time, so the exact reasons for Mary Jane leaving remain difficult to verify. Mary Jane worked in Fairmont for about a year before she moved to Ohio. She lived in residences in both Plymouth and Willard during her time in Ohio. In Ohio, Mary Jane was employed at the Wilkins Army Air Force Depot in the town of Shelby, where she worked as a high lift and fork operator. She did not have a car to commute to work, but luckily was able to get rides from coworkers. Mary Jane remained in contact with her children for a time, although that contact was sporadic and gave them little information about why she was living apart from them or about her life in Ohio. In addition to her letters, she would sometimes send them clothes. On multiple occasions, she also mailed them war bonds she had purchased at branches of the People's Bank around Shelby. These war bonds would be the subject of the last communication she had with her family. In January of 1945, she wrote home to West Virginia asking that all the war bonds be sent back to her. Her family did as she asked. They never heard from her again. Mary Jane filed for divorce from James in February of 1945. Her attorney withdrew this petition in April of 1946 after she failed to appear for court proceedings. James filed divorce papers of his own, and the divorce was granted even without Mary Jane being accounted for. He continued raising his children, and later remarried and had additional children with his second wife. He passed away in 1985. Because Mary Jane lived away from her family and wrote to them sporadically, they did not report her missing in 1945. By 1949, however, it was clear that something was wrong. In addition, 1949 was both the year that Mary Jane's oldest child, her daughter Anna Mae, turned 18, and the year Mary Jane's brother Lester returned home after serving in the Navy during World War II. Lester went to the sheriff of Marion County, West Virginia, who then wrote to authorities in Ohio. Anna Mae also tried to get in contact with her mother's employer, but did not hear back from them until May of 1952. They informed her that her mother had left her job at the depot on March 8, 1945, citing added household duties as her reason for leaving her position. Anna Mae began writing to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in hopes of getting them to help with the search for her mother. She exchanged letters with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover well into the 1960s, despite his insistence that the FBI did not have the authority to investigate Mary Jane's disappearance, and that Anna Mae would have to rely on the local authorities. In the following decades, Anna Mae would reach out to the Social Security Administration, the U.S. Treasury Department, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol, trying to find a lead in her mother's case. Decades later, the grandchildren Mary Jane never met would comb through obituaries looking to see if they could find record of her death. In 2004, they were able to get an article about Mary Jane's disappearance published in a newspaper in Plymouth, Ohio. Once DNA came into common use in law enforcement, multiple members of Mary Jane's family submitted samples of their DNA to various organizations in case they could be matched to a set of unidentified remains. Mindy Wilson, one of Mary Jane's granddaughters, reached out to Shelby Police again in October of 2018. The case was then formally reopened and assigned to Detective Adam Turner. Detective Turner grew up living above his family's funeral home, and frequently being around people who were processing grief left him with a strong sense of empathy. He understood that Mary Jane's family was hurting without resolution in her case, despite the amount of time that had passed, and dedicated himself to solving it, despite the challenges posed by the passage of time. Detective Turner used his own money to pay for trips related to the investigation and appeared on several podcasts on his own time, trying to generate leads. A major avenue of investigation for him was researching unidentified sets of remains to see if any of them could belong to Mary Jane. Over the next few years, Jane Does in multiple states were exhumed so that samples could be taken for DNA testing. None of these Jane Does turned out to be Mary Jane. However, the effort did solve an unrelated disappearance. One of the Jane Does Detective Turner researched was known as the Preble County Jane Doe, whose remains were found in Eaton, Ohio, near the Indiana state line in May of 1968. The remains were exhumed for testing in late 2019. Initial DNA tests showed that the remains could not belong to Mary Jane, but Detective Turner continued on in hopes of identifying the remains, even though they were not connected to his case. He began working with Moxie Forensic Investigations in order to use genetic genealogy to hopefully identify the remains. This effort took 3 years, in part due to pandemic-related delays, but it ultimately revealed that the remains were not those of a woman, after all, but of a man named Albert Frost. His remains had mistakenly been identified as those of a woman because he had been very small and thin, and his remains had been badly decomposed and scattered over a large area when they were found. Albert had served in the military, but then turned to a life of crime, allegedly breaking into as many as 100 cars in the town of Hamilton. He moved around a lot, and his family was not always in contact with him, so his disappearance in the 1960s was not necessarily a cause for immediate alarm. He was identified because his great-niece had her DNA profile uploaded to GEDmatch, but she had never even known that he existed until the identification was made. According to Albert's surviving nieces and nephews, the family had heard a rumor that Albert had been beaten to death outside of a bar in Eaton, but the circumstances surrounding his death are still under investigation, with Detective Turner volunteering his time to help. The big break in the case came not from a Jane Doe, but from Mary Jane's complete military file from when she was a civilian employee at the Army Air Force Depot. Detective Turner was able to obtain the file and uploaded it online. Someone he describes as a civilian sleuth who had been following the case brought to his attention a name in the file, Percy J. Sebren. During her time at the depot, Mary Jane had been promoted to high-lift fork operator. She had taken over this position from Percy, so he most likely trained her for her new responsibilities. Percy died in Kansas City, Missouri in 1969 after being hit by a train. A listing on findagrave.com showed that he was buried at New Forest Cemetery in Forest, Louisiana, and listed a woman named Mary J. Sebren, who had the same date of birth as Mary Jane Vangilder, as his wife. Mary Sebren died in 1990, and her grave was in the same cemetery. The Sebrens had 2 sons. Both of them had passed away, but Detective Turner was able to get in contact with some of the couple's grandchildren, who provided photographs of and handwriting samples from their grandmother. Forensic analysis showed that the handwriting samples were consistent with known samples from Mary Jane Vangilder. The Sebrens' grandchildren also provided DNA samples, and when they were compared to samples from Mary Jane Vangilder's known grandchildren and daughter, it confirmed that Mary Jane Sebren was in fact Mary Jane Vangilder. While Mary Jane used the name Sebren in her new life, and she and Percy lived as a married couple, there is no record of them ever being legally married. Mary Jane was also somehow able to get a new social security number for her life as Mary Jane Sebren. Mary Jane's oldest son with Percy was born in December of 1945, 9 months after she resigned from her job at the depot. It appears that once she realized she could be pregnant, she and Percy opted to start a life together immediately, rather than wait for the legal proceedings for her to divorce James to be completed. Mary Jane lived most of her second life in Arkansas. This news was of course shocking to both of Mary Jane's families. The Vangilder family obviously felt complex emotions over finally having answers, but also knowing that Mary Jane had departed from their lives willingly and never contacted them again. The Sebren family was shocked that she had such a big secret and was able to keep it for so long. They loved her dearly, and her grandchildren described her as the perfect grandmother, but she seemed to be a perfectly normal woman. She loved to garden and had a particular love for hydrangeas. She was a great cook and made meals for her family. No one in the Sebren family knew very much about Mary Jane's early life, as she did not like to discuss it. When she was dying of colon cancer in 1990, she had told one of her granddaughters that there was something she couldn't tell her and that she could never find out. At the time, her granddaughter had assumed that she was speaking nonsense because she was very ill. In light of this new information about Mary Jane and her 2 lives, however, she now knows how significant this statement was. Mindy Wilson is one of Mary Jane's granddaughters on the Vangilder side of her family. Mindy was present for the press conference in Ohio, announcing the solving of her grandmother's case on February 12, 2024. Prior to coming to Ohio, she traveled from her home in South Carolina to Louisiana to lay flowers on the grave of the grandmother she never got the chance to meet and had spent so much time looking for. Speaking at the press conference, she expressed her gratitude for Detective Turner and his dedication to solving the case. She also tearfully said, "Our family finally has closure. This search started before I was born. My aunt never gave up hope and is so happy to know what happened to her. This gives me some kind of peace and brings me closer to a woman I never met." During the press conference, in addition to providing detailed information about his investigation, Detective Turner also reflected on what can be learned from Mary Jane's case, saying, "What it shows is that our decisions can reverberate through time and distance and affect generations of our immediate family and descendants, and that our choices in life need to be made in consideration of how it will affect those who love us. Mary Jane's absence left a hole in her children's and grandchildren's lives that was a continuous wound. Questions will always remain as to why she voluntarily vanished from their lives, but at last, the investigation into her disappearance can be, and is, officially closed." In 2001, 50-year-old Leslie Prier lived in a 2-story brick home in the 4800 block of Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, Maryland, with her husband Carl. The couple's daughter, Lauren, had spent most of her childhood in this house, but the 23-year-old no longer lived at home. According to Lauren, Leslie was just as beautiful on the inside as she was on the outside, and not only was she a wonderful mother to her, she was very maternal towards all of Lauren's friends as they were growing up. On May 2nd, 2001, Carl left for work at around 7:30 in the morning. Leslie was also working that day. She was due in at her job at Specialties Incorporated, an advertising production company, at 10 o'clock. She never made it. When she failed to show up on time, her boss called Leslie's daughter and her husband to see if they knew where she was. Carl met his wife's boss at the home on Drummond Avenue at approximately 11:35. When they opened the door, it was immediately apparent that something was wrong. There was blood all over the foyer, a table had been knocked over, and a rug was out of place. Carl went inside to begin calling local hospitals, thinking Leslie had been taken to one. Leslie's boss called 911, and the dispatcher advised them to get out of the house. Police arrived on the scene at 11:47. When they searched the house, they discovered Leslie's body, halfway inside the shower in the master bathroom. She was face down, with her legs sticking out of the stall. Leslie's autopsy and the forensic examination of the house showed that Leslie had been killed in the foyer, not in the master bathroom. Bruising and hemorrhaging around her neck were consistent with manual strangulation, and bruises on her arms and torso indicated that she had been struck in those spots. She had 7 lacerations to her head, with corresponding marks on her skull. These injuries appear to have been inflicted as her head was slammed into the sharp baseboard molding in the foyer. Her killer had attempted to clean the crime scene, and it appeared that he had carried her body up to the shower in order to wash away blood evidence. Simply by virtue of the fact that he was married to the victim, Carl Prier was initially considered a suspect in Leslie's murder, although no evidence was ever found to tie him to the crime. Despite a large volume of evidence being collected at the scene and an extensive investigation, it would be more than 2 decades before an arrest was finally made in Leslie's case. In 2024, Leslie's daughter Lauren was 46, with a strong circle of friends and a good job. She missed her mother greatly and still had hope that the case would be solved and she would find some measure of closure. She finally received the phone call she had been waiting 23 years for on June 18, 2024, when she was notified that a suspect had been taken into custody that day and was being charged with first-degree murder. However, any relief she felt at the news was quickly tempered by a feeling of betrayal when she was told who had allegedly killed her mother. It was someone she knew, Eugene Gligor, her high school boyfriend. As a teenager, Eugene had lived near the Priers and attended Bethesda Chevy Chase High School with Lauren. They had many mutual friends and eventually fell in love. Eugene spent a lot of time in the Priers' home, regularly eating meals with Lauren and her parents. He also went on vacations with them to different beaches up and down the East Coast. Eugene's parents were going through a contentious divorce, which Lauren knew he was having a difficult time coping with. She also knew that some of his relatives had bad tempers, but she never saw any concerning behavior from him, despite his family's troubles. Leslie Prior was fond of Eugene, but Carl Prior would occasionally tell his daughter that he thought something was off with the young man. Lauren and Eugene dated for 5 years. They broke up after 2 years of their relationship being long distance because Lauren had gone away for college. The breakup was amicable and only occurred because they were both young and wanted some more freedom. Despite the important part Leslie had played during his adolescence, Eugene did not attend her funeral 3 years after his breakup with Lauren. Instead, he drove across the country to visit a friend in Portland, not telling the friend he was coming until he had already started the drive. He ran into Lauren in a bar a few months later. She told him that her mother had died, to which he responded, "I'm so sorry." Lauren and Eugene saw each other a few times over the following years at events with their mutual friends. They last saw each other in 2019 following a memorial service for one of those friends. They had a conversation, but Leslie's murder did not come up. While Lauren was sure Eugene could not have had anything to do with her mother's murder, her father was not as certain. He had mentioned Eugene as a possible suspect a few times over the years, but Lauren had always dismissed the idea. Carl Prior passed away of septic shock in 2017, never learning that his suspicions about his daughter's ex-boyfriend were correct. The last time Lauren had been contacted about Eugene prior to his arrest had been concerning, but still had not changed her mind about him being a potential suspect in her mother's case. She had received a text message from Eugene's brother in 2021 in which he said that he was afraid Eugene was going to hurt him. She did not know what to do, and therefore did not get involved. In general, friends and co-workers have shared Lauren Prior's shock at Gligor being implicated in the murder. A former co-worker told the Washington Post that he could not imagine Gligor hurting a fly. Friends have described him as warm, gregarious, and zen. At work, he was known for being introspective and concerned about the culture and community of his workplace. However, at least one person, a former co-worker, noted that Gligor's kind and calm exterior masked a bad temper and a superiority complex that would be revealed if Gligor was ever challenged or questioned. The co-worker told the Washington Post, "Some people are receptive and warm. He does that at first when he meets everybody, but then is a giant, condescending prick." Still, this co-worker had not believed Gligor to be a physically violent person. While in recent years, Gligor has at least presented a more calm demeanor overall, he does have concerning behavior in his past. According to the Montgomery County Police Department, he had previously been arrested for weapons possession, driving under the influence, and theft. He is also listed as a suspect in thefts from residences and burglary in police incident reports. The dates of these offenses have not been released. None of these charges resulted in Gligor being required to submit a sample of his DNA. Gligor's first marriage ended in divorce in 2015. He was known to have struggled with alcohol abuse during this time. He appears to have gotten sober by 2018, by which time he was regularly talking about attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and recommending self-help books to coworkers. Gligor remarried, and in 2021, around the time Lauren Prior received the concerning text message from his brother, his second wife filed for an order of protection against him. She alleged that he was displaying erratic and frightening behavior, punching walls and throwing objects. A Montgomery County District Court commissioner denied her petition, stating in a court document that there was no reasonable grounds to believe that abuse, as defined in the statute, occurred. The couple later divorced. By 2024, Gligor had begun dating someone new and was living a comfortable life in Washington, D.C., full of social and cultural events. On June 9th, he was in Dulles Airport to catch a flight to Europe. He opened a bottle of water, drank it, and threw it in the trash before getting on his flight. Unbeknownst to him, the bottle was collected by an investigator and tested for DNA. 9 days later, on June 18th, after he arrived home from his trip, Gligor was arrested by the U.S. Marshals Task Force in Washington, D.C., because the DNA from his water bottle was a match to DNA from the crime scene. DNA evidence was available in the case because of how hard Leslie Prior had fought for her life. Unknown male DNA was found underneath her fingernails, which presumably was deposited there as she tried to fight off her killer. That DNA was a match to DNA extracted from blood found in 3 other locations throughout the crime scene: under a baseboard beneath a window in the dining room, on the kitchen doorway connected to the dining room, and on the interior side of the kitchen door. In 2022, investigators began using genetic genealogy to attempt to identify the contributor of the unknown DNA. The DNA profile from the crime scene was run through the database of Family Tree DNA, a consumer DNA testing site, which allows for use by law enforcement. This resulted in distant matches to numerous individuals, and Gligor was one of the surnames that appeared in these results. When police searched their records in Leslie's case for this surname, they found a reference to Eugene Gligor. He was in the file because one of his previous neighbors had called in a tip, stating that they suspected he was involved in Leslie Prior's murder, 9 months after the crime was committed. This was a neighbor who had lived near the Gligors at the time of the murder, not far from the Prior home. The neighbor had contacted the police when they had learned that Eugene was connected to Leslie's daughter Lauren. Eugene and his mother had moved out of the neighborhood approximately 6 months after Leslie was killed, but prior to that, the home had regularly been visited by police due to noise complaints and underage drinking. At the time the tip was made, Gligor was not interviewed, nor was a DNA sample collected from him. This overlap between the genealogical search and the case file made investigators confident that Eugene Gligor could be a potential suspect, which is what led them to surreptitiously collecting his water bottle and getting a sample of his DNA, which did prove to be a match, and led to his arrest. Lauren Prior was present for Gligor's first court appearance, supported by 2 longtime friends she and Gligor shared. Prior to the court appearance, she told journalist Emily Davies that she wanted to be there because she wanted to see Gligor finally be in court, and wished she could give him a piece of her mind. Gligor has waived his right to a bond hearing. He remains in custody without bond because prosecutors consider him to be a flight risk due to his frequent international travel. Terri McAdams was blonde, beautiful, and popular. In high school, she was a cheerleader who drove a convertible. In the movies, this kind of character is often a mean girl, but in reality, Terri was kind and exuberant, always managing to find new friends. She loved dancing and driving around with her friends, singing along with the radio. She adored her 2 younger sisters, spending lots of time with them, and eventually teaching them how to drive. Terri began college at the University of Arkansas, where she was a member of the Phi Mu sorority. She changed her major several times because she was interested in so many topics. While she had trouble landing on a course of study, her education was very important to her. While at school, she met the man who would become her fiancé. They planned to marry in December of 1985. When Terry's fiancé got a job in Arlington, Texas, she moved there with him and transferred to the University of Texas at Arlington. The couple was living in Arlington during a time when numerous young women were going missing or being killed. These crimes ultimately led to authorities investigating the possibility that 1 or more serial killers were active in the area. When Terri learned of the crimes, she took extraordinary measures to protect herself. She quit her job in the city of Irving because it required her to work late enough that she had to drive home in the dark. She rarely left her apartment after dark even to go buy groceries. 22-year-old Terri believed that she was safe while not out in public, but that belief was tragically proven wrong. On February 13, 1985, Terri was preparing for Valentine's Day. Her fiancé was out of town, but he would be coming home the following day. Terri was at his apartment making a heart-shaped cake to give him after she picked him up from the airport. After baking the cake, she spoke with her sister on the phone. Sometime after she hung up the phone, someone broke into the apartment using a sliding door in the bedroom. The following afternoon, a maintenance worker from the apartment complex discovered Terri's body. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. It would later be determined that she had been beaten with a blunt object, but that object was not located at the scene. Her $5,000 engagement ring had been stolen. It would be decades before the case would be solved. Police ultimately learned that the killer was someone who had been interviewed very early on in the investigation. On August 14, 2024, Arlington Police and the FBI announced that they had identified Terri's killer as Bernard Sharp. Sharp could not be arrested or charged with the crime because he was deceased. Less than 9 months after Terri's murder, Sharp shot 3 people: his wife, one of her friends, and her cousin. He killed his wife and her friend, and the cousin was critically injured. After shooting the 3 of them, he turned his gun on himself and took his own life. Sharp had been interviewed in 1985 during the investigation into Terri's murder because he was known to have sexually assaulted at least 2 other women, and because he lived near the crime scene. Sharp was tied to Terri's murder through DNA. In 2021, evidence from the case had been sent for forensic testing, which led to the identification of a DNA profile from a then unknown man. Detective Devin Kofer of the Arlington Police Homicide Unit was assigned to Terri's case in January of 2024. He worked with the FBI in Dallas, who had begun using investigative genetic genealogy in the case the previous August. This effort eventually identified Sharp as a potential suspect. Since he was deceased and could not provide a DNA sample, Detective Kofer contacted his family instead. He traveled to visit a close genetic relative of Sharp. This relative is not being identified to protect their privacy, and the only information made public about them is that they live outside of Texas. This relative provided a sample of their DNA. Testing of this sample confirmed that Sharp would be a genetic match to the crime scene DNA. Terri's parents passed away before her killer was identified, but Terri's 2 sisters, brother-in-law, and stepmother attended the press conference declaring her case closed. Terri's younger sister Karen said during it, "Terri was an amazing girl, beautiful and full of life. She was a friend to everyone. To know her was to love her. As I stand here today, I know that she and my mom and dad are smiling down on this miraculous moment." Dorothy Silzel, who went by Dottie, grew up as the youngest of 9 siblings in Mandan, North Dakota. She was very popular with her nieces and nephews. She would hand sew Barbie doll clothes for her nieces to dress their dolls in. After graduating high school in North Dakota, Dottie briefly worked for a school district there before moving to Washington State. In 1980, 30-year-old Dottie had just bought a condominium in Kent, Washington, south of Seattle. She worked full-time as a training supervisor for Boeing and was a regular volunteer with the Special Olympics. On February 26, 1980, Kent police arrived at Dottie's condo on 106th Avenue Southeast to perform a welfare check on her. A family friend joined the police officer there. The 26th was the second day in a row Dottie had not reported for work at Boeing without giving notice, which was out of character for her, and raised concerns with her coworkers and the family members they had contacted. When the police officer and family friend arrived at Dottie's condo, her front door was locked, but 3 newspapers were piled up in front of it. When they went around to the back of the condo, The curtains covering the rear sliding glass door were closed, but the door itself was open, with a 16 to 18-inch opening. Later investigation by crime scene technicians would show that the screws connecting the locking anchor to the door were loose, which allowed the door to be opened. Inside, they found Dottie's nude body on the floor of a room on the second floor. A brown bathrobe had been tied around her lower left arm and hand. The King County Medical Examiner's Office later determined that Dottie had been strangled to death. She had also suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Dottie's body showed signs of lividity, meaning she had been dead for some time before her body was discovered. She had last been seen alive 3 days earlier, on February 23rd. She was seen leaving Gaetano's Pizza sometime after 10 p.m. In addition to working full-time at Boeing, Dottie also worked part-time as a waitress at the pizza place. Authorities believe she was killed on the 23rd, sometime after she arrived home from her shift. It was also determined during the autopsy that Dottie had been sexually assaulted. During the autopsy, semen was discovered and various swabs were taken from Dottie's body and the bathrobe. The evidence was well preserved, which led to the case being solved after decades of technological advancements. The Washington State Police Crime Lab began looking for DNA evidence in Dottie's case in 1996, but it took until 2002 for the required technology to be available for them to develop a DNA profile to enter into the combined DNA index system. No match was found in the system. In 2015, Dottie's family contacted Sergeant Tim Ford, a supervisor in the Kent Police Major Crimes Unit, and asked for his help in finally solving her case. Sergeant Ford began looking into the case and felt determined to solve it. His assignment changed over the next few years, but he brought the box of files connected to Dottie's case with him wherever he was assigned. He had planned to retire in March of 2024, but he continued working because Dottie's murder had not yet been closed. However, Sergeant Ford was able to obtain an arrest warrant in Dottie's case not long after he delayed his retirement. On August 20th, 2024, 65-year-old Kenneth Dwayne Kundert was arrested at his rural home near Clinton, Arkansas, and charged with first-degree murder in connection to Dottie's case. Kundert was identified thanks to genetic genealogy. In March of 2022, senior forensic genealogist Misty Gillis began trying to find relatives of the contributor of the DNA found at the crime scene at Sergeant Ford's request. Using the GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA databases, she eventually identified 11 potential suspects. All of the 11 men were first cousins. Police began investigating these individuals to see which of them left their DNA at the crime scene. 2 of these 11 men were brothers, Kurt and Kenneth Kundert. Kent police began their investigation into the 2 of them in September of 2023. At that time, both of the brothers were in custody in Arkansas for an unrelated assault. The sheriff's office in Arkansas agreed to help facilitate interviews and obtain voluntary DNA samples from the brothers. Kurt agreed to provide a sample of his DNA. Kenneth did not. Testing showed that Kurt's DNA was not a match to the DNA at the crime scene. During his interview, detectives noted that Kenneth was smoking and would put his used cigarette butts in his pocket rather than throw them out. Kenneth Kundert lived a very nomadic lifestyle, so confirming his whereabouts at the time of Dottie's murder was difficult. Employment records show that Kenneth worked in Seattle and Snohomish County in 1987, but records from before that year were unavailable. Investigators have discovered information that Kenneth lived with his brother Kurt in an apartment just 1,200 feet away from Dottie's condo at the time of her murder. On March 22, 2024, Kent police detectives flew to Arkansas to conduct surveillance on Kenneth Kundert. They witnessed him smoke an all-white cigarette in his truck in a Walmart parking lot and put the butt of the cigarette into a receptacle outside of the store when he was finished. They collected the contents of the receptacle and tested the 3 all-white cigarette butts they found for DNA. The DNA profile extracted from one of them was a match to the DNA at the crime scene. This match allowed investigators to obtain the warrant for Kundert's arrest and for a formal DNA sample. Kundert has convictions and arrests for misdemeanor offenses in 4 states. Kundert's bail has been set at $3 million. He was initially fighting his extradition to Washington state, but has since waived his right to. On August 25, 2024, more than 24 of Dottie's family members, in town for the press conference on the 28th that would announce Kundert's arrest, gathered at her grave in Washington state to remember her and share their gratitude for the work of the Kent Police Department, especially that of Sergeant Ford. "31-year-old Shannon Danielle Holihan lived in Grand Blanc, Michigan, and worked in the nearby city of Troy as a computer programmer for the Kmart Corporation. He lived with his mother to help take care of her, as she had previously suffered a stroke. He was described by his friends as kind-hearted and fun-loving. Shannon's mother began calling some of his friends around 9 a.m. on May 27, 1998. He had not come home the night before and had not called her, which was not like him. Soon his employer would call because he had not shown up to work that day, which was also out of character. Shannon's friends spent the better part of the day looking for him. Around 5 p.m., they finally located him. He was a John Doe at Hurley Medical Center. Shannon had been found unconscious around 8:30 that morning behind the Empress of China restaurant on Dort Highway in Flint, Michigan, by the owner of the restaurant as he was coming in to work. Shannon was only partially clothed, wearing only a t-shirt. He had suffered multiple blows to the back of his head. He remained in the hospital in a coma for several days, before passing away on May 30th. Shannon was last seen conscious in the early hours of the 27th in the parking lot of a gay bar down the street from the restaurant where he would later be found. Shannon was known to meet with men he had met at the bar behind that restaurant. Shortly before he drove off, he was seen talking to a white man on a mountain bike. The man was initially described by witnesses as being average-looking and of average height, although estimates of his age ranged from 15 to 35. Later reports describe him as being around 30 and riding a white bicycle. Shannon drove a white 1994 Chevrolet Corvette, which was missing and has never been found. It would be 26 years before an arrest was made for Shannon's murder. On October 10, 2024, the Flint Police Department announced that 53-year-old Eric Dukes of Metamora, Michigan, had been arraigned on charges of felony murder and carjacking in connection to Shannon's case. If convicted, he could be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton has stated that it is believed Shannon's murder was a hate crime, committed because Shannon was a member of the LGBTQ community. However, the case cannot be prosecuted as such because the state's current intimidation laws were not in place at the time Shannon was killed. In early 2023, the Flint City Council voted to use some of their American Rescue Plan Act funds to form a cold case investigation unit. The unit also received a grant from the Mott Foundation. Shannon's case is the first in which the new unit has made an arrest. Dukes was initially brought to investigators' attention because of a Crime Stoppers tip in an unrelated investigation. Dukes was recently arrested for unlawfully driving away in an automobile. The automobile in question was an ambulance. This arrest gave investigators access to his DNA, which was found to be a match to DNA found under Shannon's fingernails. Investigators believe the DNA was deposited there when Shannon used his hands to try to defend himself as he tried to fight off his killer. In a Facebook post announcing the arrest, the Flint Police Department reminded the public that this case proves that a tip that may seem insignificant can lead to justice and closure for those grieving families, even decades after their loss. Theresa Marcoux and Mark Harnish were both graduates of East Longmeadow High School in East Longmeadow, Massachusetts. 18-year-old Theresa loved to laugh and always had a smile on her face. 20-year-old Mark, on the other hand, had a more reserved personality, but was very courteous. In 1978, Theresa was working as a clerk in the pet department of a local hardware store, and Mark was employed at a car repair shop. Mark and Theresa were last seen alive shortly after midnight on November 19, 1978, when they left a friend's party together. Roughly 9 hours later, at 9:30 a.m., a West Springfield Police Department officer was out on patrol when he saw a green 1967 Dodge pickup truck parked in a rest area along Route 5 in West Springfield. He noticed that the driver's side window of the truck had been damaged. When he got closer, he saw that there was blood in and around the vehicle. As he further inspected the scene, he discovered 2 bodies just over a nearby guardrail. The truck belonged to Mark Harnish, and it was his and Theresa Marcoux's bodies that were found near it. Mark and Theresa had both been shot multiple times. Police believed they had been killed inside of Mark's truck, and then their bodies had been moved. Spent projectiles found inside the truck and during the autopsies were examined and found to have all been fired from the same unknown firearm, which was capable of firing .38 caliber ammunition. The medical examiner placed Mark and Theresa's times of death in the early morning hours of the 19th. A witness who lived near the crime scene reported hearing gunshots around 4 a.m. Police did find what would prove to be a critical clue: a bloody fingerprint on the passenger side vent window of the truck. It did not belong to either Mark or Theresa. Over the years, as the investigation went on, this fingerprint was manually compared to over 70,000 sets of fingerprints on file with various law enforcement agencies, and later run through the Massachusetts Automated Fingerprint Identification System. No match was found. In the fall of 2024, the Hampton District Attorney's Office was contacted by an individual who was able to give them the name of someone they believed had been involved in Mark and Theresa's murders. They had gotten the name from a friend who had since passed away. Investigators learned that the individual the tipster had named had provided his fingerprints when he had applied for a taxicab license in 2000. When they compared those fingerprints to the one found at the crime scene, they found a match to his left thumbprint. This individual was living in Springfield, Massachusetts at the time of the murders, and was also a licensed gun owner who had purchased a Colt handgun just 1 month before Theresa and Mark were killed. He did not have a significant criminal record. This evidence led to a 2-count murder complaint and arrest warrant being issued by the Springfield District Court on October 29, 2024. The following day, 71-year-old Timothy Scott Jolie was arrested at his home in Clearwater, Florida. On November 5th, he appeared before a circuit judge in Pinellas County, Florida, and waived extradition. He is expected to be returned to Massachusetts in the next few weeks to face the murder charges. Theresa and Mark's parents have all passed away, but other members of their families were present at the press conference, announcing Jolie's arrest. "52-year-old Ruth Buchanan of Forest City, North Carolina, loved her husband and their 2 children. She enjoyed square dancing and always found ways to give back to her community. On December 29, 1989, Ruth went shopping with a friend to take advantage of the after-Christmas sales at some department stores in the city of Charlotte. Ruth was going to Florida to celebrate New Year's, so she wanted to pick up a few new pieces of clothing for the vacation. Ruth and her friend crossed the street at the intersection of 5th and North Tryon Streets. While they were in the intersection, a car going approximately 45 miles an hour ran the red light and struck Ruth. She was thrown 10 feet into the air and landed on the other side of the intersection. The driver did not stop. Instead of stopping to help Ruth, he fled the scene. Ruth was rushed to Charlotte Memorial Hospital, but died there as a result of her injuries the following afternoon. Luckily for police, there were numerous witnesses to the hit and run who were able to provide a description of the car as well as its license plate number. Unfortunately, the car turned out to be stolen. It had been taken from the lot of a car dealership. On January 1st, 1990, police responded to a call about a suspicious car at a Comfort Inn in the 4400 block of South Tryon Street. The dark blue 1990 Mitsubishi Galant fit the description of the car used in the hit and run, and had the license plate number witnesses had reported. The car had extensive damage consistent with hitting a pedestrian. Forensic examination would confirm that this was the car that had struck Ruth. The car was processed for evidence, but it would be over 30 years before a clue collected from it would help solve the case. In early 2022, Crime Stoppers received an anonymous tip. The caller identified a man they believed to have been involved in the hit and run. Ultimately, investigators determined that the man named in the tip had not been the driver. However, it did bring Ruth's case to their attention. It had not been recently revisited because the department's electronic reporting system did not cover cases as old as Ruth's. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department Crime Lab then went through all of the evidence that had been preserved from the car after it was found at the Comfort Inn. One of the preserved items was a marijuana joint, which they believed they could extract DNA from. They successfully did so and found a match in the criminal database. The DNA belonged to a man named Herbert Stanback. However, records showed that he had been incarcerated at the time Ruth was killed, at a facility called Charlotte Correctional, which no longer exists. At the time his DNA was found on the joint, he was incarcerated at Scotland Correctional Institution in Laurinburg, North Carolina, for an unrelated crime. Investigators went to speak with him there on 2 separate occasions. During the first visit, Stanback asked for time to think before he spoke to the detective. On the second visit, on March 20th, 2024, he made a full confession. Stanback said that he had been too afraid to stop when he hit Ruth. He saw in the paper that she had died and assumed that police would find and arrest him soon. Even as decades passed, he knew that the crime would eventually catch up to him. When he struck and killed Ruth in 1989, Stanback had actually been on a work release program at Charlotte Correctional, leaving in the morning to go to work and returning to the correctional facility at night. He was employed at a hotel just a few blocks from the crime scene. In June of 2024, Stanback was transported to the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office and formally charged in Ruth's case. He later pled guilty to felony hit and run, resulting in serious injury or death, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, to be served concurrently with the previous sentence. Susan Wolfe was a free spirit with a bubbly personality. She was a natural caretaker who loved helping and taking care of others. She had 2 younger brothers and was like a second mother to them, caring for them and playing with them. As an adult, Susan was working hard to make caretaking her career. She was taking classes and working at the Austin State Hospital in hopes of getting accepted into the nursing program at the University of Texas in Austin. On January 9, 1980, 4 days before Susan's 26th birthday, She went to the university and was accepted into a work-study program that would help her eventually get her nursing degree. Later that night, Susan was walking to a friend's house because her own home was being fumigated. Susan was not a very materialistic person, to the point that she did not own a car, so she walked or biked everywhere. Around 10 p.m., just a block away from her home, she was abducted. A witness saw a car stop and the driver exit the vehicle. He put Susan in what the witness described as a bear hug, threw a jacket over her head, and forced her into the vehicle. There was a passenger in the car, but the witness could not see what they were doing during the abduction. The witness was confident in his identification of the car as a maroon 1970 Dodge Polara because he had worked repairing cars. The following morning, Susan's body was found in an alley off of East 17th Street. She had been killed by a single gunshot to the head. The medical examiner also found evidence of ligature strangulation and sexual assault. Within the first year of their investigation, the Austin Police Department developed at least 40 persons of interest and interviewed 6 suspects. They investigated individuals who drove the type of car used in Susan's abduction and placed the witness to the abduction under hypnosis, in hopes of getting more details. However, it would be decades before their efforts paid off. In April of 2023, detectives from the Austin Police Department Cold Case Unit submitted evidence related to Susan's sexual assault to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory. By the following February, the lab had developed an STR profile and eliminated the 6 suspects that had been identified early on in the investigation. When the sample was run through the combined DNA index system, a partial match was found to an inmate in Massachusetts. Further testing would be required to confirm that this individual's DNA was a match to that found at the crime scene. The Travis County District Court issued a warrant to obtain a direct DNA sample from this individual in June of 2024. Detectives traveled to Massachusetts to execute the warrant and obtain the DNA sample. When they did so, they were able to briefly interview the inmate, who did acknowledge that he was in Austin and San Antonio around the time of Susan's murder. When he was told about the DNA, he invoked his right to counsel. Testing of the direct DNA sample showed that the inmate was a match to the DNA from Susan's case. Based on this evidence, as well as the rest of the findings of the investigation, the Austin Municipal Court issued an arrest warrant charging Deck Brewer Jr. with the murder of Susan Wolfe on August 14, 2024. 78-year-old Brewer's sentence in Massachusetts did not end until August 28th, so he would not be extradited to Texas until he completed serving it. The crime he was serving the sentence for has not been released, although he was incarcerated in the Massachusetts Treatment Center, a medium-security prison for male sex offenders and individuals who have been civilly committed because they are considered to be sexually dangerous. Susan's younger brother Charles was 10 years younger than her, and just a junior in high school when she was killed. He had to take 6 months off of school following her murder to deal with his grief. During that time, he rode around town on his bicycle, distributing flyers and doing whatever he could to ask for the public's help in the investigation. Susan's death was an open wound for him and the rest of Susan's family that they were not sure would ever heal. They held on to hope that her case would one day be solved, but after more than 40 years, Charles had started to let go of that dream. He was therefore shocked and overjoyed when he saw on the news that an arrest had been made in his sister's case. He was also somewhat upset that the police had not contacted him with the news prior to it being made public. Susan's parents passed away without learning who took their daughter from them, and Charles had contacted the Austin Police Department in 2019 after his mother died to be sure he was the point of contact for any updates in the case. The department has since been in contact with him. The Austin Police Department is still hoping to identify the passenger in the car during Susan's abduction. They are asking that any member of the public with information come forward. Danielle Danny Houchins grew up as the oldest of 3 children in a close-knit family. She and her younger sister and brother inherited their parents' love of adventure and the outdoors. They would go hiking, river rafting, rock climbing, and fishing. The family moved from Minnesota to Montana in the early 1990s to start a new chapter and to take advantage of the nearby mountains. Danny's parents loved skiing and worked on the ski patrol at the resort at Big Sky. Danny was a strong skier herself and inspired her younger sister to work harder to keep up with her. Danny had a dry sense of humor and could make anyone laugh almost as soon as she met them. She showed affection by playing tricks and pranks on her friends. She was very smart and an exceptional student. She excelled particularly in the fields of math and science. She hoped to pursue those fields in her career one day, potentially going into the medical field or studying marine biology. She also loved music, particularly the grunge bands that became so popular in the 90s. Saturday, September 21st, 1996, was the day of the town fall festival in Belgrade, Montana, which was held in the park that was just across the street from the Houchins family home. It was also Danny's father's birthday. 15-year-old Danny had been scheduled to go on a trip with her church youth group that day, but she decided at the last minute not to go. Instead, she woke up early to make her father a birthday cake. However, unbeknownst to Danny, her father was not home that morning. He had gone out to celebrate his birthday with his friends the night before. He had been drinking and decided that he was not fit to drive home. Danny was upset that he did not get home until later that morning, after she had stayed home from her trip for his birthday. Danny wanted to blow off some steam. As she often did, she sought refuge in the outdoors. Shortly before noon, she asked her mother Cheryl if she could go out to Cameron Bridge Fishing Access, a marshy, wooded area a few miles south of town. Cheryl reminded her daughter that they were having friends over later that day. She told Danny that she could go, but that she had to be home by 2 o'clock. Cheryl gave Danny her watch so that she would know when to come home. Danny did not return home by 2 o'clock. Danny would not have intentionally broken her promise to her mother, even though she had been upset that morning. Cheryl and one of her friends went to Cameron Bridge to look for Danny, arriving there around 3 p.m. They found Danny's white Chevrolet truck, which had been left unlocked despite the fact that valuable items that Danny normally took good care of, like her CDs and her father's computer, were inside of it. Danny's water bottle and keys were found along a trail leading away from the parking lot where the truck was parked. However, they could not find Danny. Danny was a new driver, so the unlocked car and discarded keys, held together by the numerous keychains Danny had proudly been collecting now that she could drive, immediately raised concerns for Cheryl. She ran through the immediate vicinity, calling Danny's name, and checking the bathrooms and other possible places Danny could conceivably be. She left a note on the truck telling Danny to wait there for her in case she came back, and began searching areas farther away from the parking lot. Just after 5 p.m., she contacted the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office asking for help. Deputies responded to the scene, and they soon made the decision to call in Gallatin County Search and Rescue. They, along with volunteer search groups, soon arrived to perform a grid search of the area. However, the searchers were called back after a few hours, once it got dark. The fishing access was near a river and other smaller waterways, and surrounded by dense woodlands. In addition, there was no ambient light in the area, making it very, very dark. Therefore, it was determined that continuing the search after dark would be unsafe for those conducting it. While the official search was called off for the night, some family friends of the Houchins family, who were familiar with the area, continued looking for Danny, despite the serious risks to their own safety. Danny's 12-year-old sister Stephanie was with a friend, doing her own search in town. Her friend's mother drove them around town so that they could show Danny's picture to members of the public. One of the places they stopped to show the pictures and ask for help was at the girls' high school basketball game. A close friend of Stephanie's, Levi, was at the basketball game that night and heard the details of Danny's disappearance. Levi and his family lived very close to the fishing access area where Danny had gone missing. Because his father was very familiar with Cameron Bridge, Levi called him and begged him to go help look for Danny. His father, Kelle, was very reluctant, but ultimately went down to the fishing access to look for Danny. After he searched for a short time, the batteries in Kelle's flashlight died, so he went to his brother Mike's home, which was nearby. They got new batteries and then went out looking for Danny together. After about 45 minutes of searching, Mike was about to tell his brother that they should go home for the night. Before he had a chance to, Kelle found Danny. When Mike walked over to his brother, he saw the back of Danny's head and could tell immediately that she was dead. Danny's father, Rex, had gone back to Cameron Bridge to look for Danny one last time for the night. He was going into the woods as Mike and Kelle were coming out of them, and was told that his daughter's body had been found. Danny had been found lying face down in shallow water underneath a lot of marshy overgrowth. Her left arm was up above her head, and her mother's watch had been pulled down from her wrist onto her left hand. She was missing one of her sandals, which was later found some 20 feet away from where her body had been found. Her bra had been pushed up above her breasts, and the lower left edge of her underwear was rolled over. These details made it appear that her body had been pulled by her left arm to where it was found, and concealed under the grasses and reeds of the swampy area. The medical examiner found muddy material in Danny's stomach and upper and lower airways. There was a recent laceration in her vagina, indicative of some sort of sexual assault. 4 naturally shedded arm hairs that did not belong to Danny and could not be matched to anyone in her life were found in her underwear and on her cervix. The medical examiner found that Danny had died by drowning and ruled the manner of her death as undetermined rather than as a homicide. Until such time additional information indicates otherwise, the manner of death is undetermined, he wrote in his report. This finding was baffling to many familiar with the details of the case, both in Danny's family and in law enforcement. The scene appeared to indicate that Danny had been dragged by her arm so that her body could be concealed, and there was evidence of sexual assault, all of which meant that someone else was involved in Danny's death. While he claimed Danny's death was being investigated as a homicide, Gallatin County Sheriff Bill Slaughter also told the Bozeman Daily Chronicle that there was no indication of foul play in the case. "I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that this may have been an accidental drowning," he told the publication. Sheriff Slaughter's public reasoning for this belief was what he claimed was a lack of cuts or bruises on Danny's body. However, there were minor blunt force injuries to Danny's head and extremities, as well as cuts on the sides of her face that could have come from running through the woods or from trying to pull someone's hands away from her face. A major sticking point for the sheriff was the fact that Danny had been wearing a knee brace on the day of her death. She had injured her knee a few weeks earlier, dancing with friends, but her injury was nearly healed, and she was due to be cleared to stop wearing the brace by her doctor soon. However, the sheriff believed she could have re-injured her knee while at the fishing access, gotten stuck in the mud, fallen over, and drowned. However, Danny was very athletic and a strong swimmer. Furthermore, the water she was found in was so shallow that all Danny would have had to do was turn her head to the side in order to be able to breathe. The only substance detected on her toxicology screening was caffeine, so there were no drugs in Danny's system, that would have impaired her body's natural instincts to fight to be able to breathe. In addition, this scenario does not explain how mud was forced into Danny's airway and stomach. Drowning victims generally are found to have water in their lungs. The presence of mud throughout Danny's body was more consistent with her head being forced underwater and into the mud below. Former Sheriff's Detective Cindy Botek became a Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy just days before Danny died. She has publicly stated that investigating Danny's case never appeared to be a priority to the leadership in the sheriff's office, and that when she joined the Detective Bureau in 2006 and tried to pursue new leads in Danny's case, she was met with resistance from her bosses and received no help from previous investigators assigned to the case. Former Sheriff Slaughter has denied ever deprioritizing Danny's case and has said that it was always treated as a homicide, regardless of its formal classification. However, multiple individuals connected to the sheriff's office at the time of Danny's death have been critical of how the office handled Danny's case and have stated that the leadership within the office was too quick to dismiss Danny's death as an accident or imply that it was somehow a suicide. A former sheriff's deputy has reported that Sheriff Slaughter's attitude seemed to indicate that he just wanted the case to be over. Fortunately, this attitude was not shared by everyone in the sheriff's office or by investigators who joined the office years later. As technology advanced, new forensic examinations were done on the evidence in Danny's case. Since the hairs found on her body had been naturally shed, they did not contain their roots, which are their main source of nuclear DNA. These hairs do, however, normally contain mitochondrial DNA. In 2019, Danny's family began more actively campaigning for the investigation into her case to receive additional resources. They learned that Sheriff's Captain Matt Boxmeyer had taken an interest in finally solving the case. Danny's case was reopened in 2019. In 2021, Dan Springer became sheriff of Gallatin County and committed additional resources to the investigation. He hired Tom Elfmont, a retired Los Angeles Police Department officer who was working as a private investigator. Tom, in turn, sought out the help of Sergeant Court Depweg of the Newport Beach Police Department, who specializes in using DNA technology to solve cases. In August of 2023, Danny's case was finally formally reclassified as a homicide after semen was discovered in her underwear during a re-examination of the evidence in her case. As had long been suspected by those close to the case, there needed to be advancements in DNA technology before a suspect could finally be identified in Danny's case. The 4 foreign hairs found on Danny's body were submitted to Astria Forensics in California. They were able to use cutting-edge forensic DNA genome sequencing to develop a partial DNA profile from one of them. There were no matches to this profile in the combined DNA index system. The profile was therefore sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia in hopes that they could use genetic genealogy to find a match. Parabon successfully did so in 2024, identifying a potential suspect as a man named Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson. Hutchinson had no criminal or traffic history, and his name had not come up during the investigation up until this point. In 2024, Hutchinson was a 55-year-old married father of 2 adult children. He had worked for 22 years as a fisheries biologist for the Bureau of Land Management, based in the agency's field office in Dillon, Montana, where he also lived. In September of 1996, when Danny was killed, he had just enrolled as a student at Montana State University in Bozeman. On July 23, 2024, investigators approached Hutchinson outside the Bureau of Land Management office where he worked, as he unloaded a pickup truck with 2 other people. When they identified themselves as being with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and said that they were hoping to speak with him, Hutchinson went pale. Hutchinson was interviewed for approximately 2 hours. During this interview, investigators report that he showed signs of being extremely nervous. He was sweating profusely, scratching at his face, and biting his hand. He was shown a picture of Danny, and in response, he slumped down in his chair and looked uncomfortable. After the interview, his behavior, especially his driving, was erratic. At 4:17 the following morning, Hutchinson called 911 and asked for assistance before hanging up. When deputies from the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office arrived at his location, they found his body on the side of the road. He had shot himself in the head. A DNA sample was taken from his body, and it was a match to the DNA found on Danny's body. Gallatin County Sheriff Dan Springer announced that Hutchinson had been identified as the individual responsible for Danny's rape and murder on August 8, 2024. There is no known connection between Danny and Hutchinson. Hutchinson was known to be an avid outdoorsman, so it is feasible that he had been at Cameron Bridge that day in 1996 for recreational purposes. Danny's rape and murder appear to have been crimes of opportunity. An obituary for Hutchinson was briefly posted online, but once he was publicly identified as Danny's killer by the sheriff's office, his wife replaced it with a statement which read, "We are absolutely heartbroken to learn this news, and our hearts go out to the Hutchins family. It is good to know that they will at last be able to find the closure that they deserve. Our own family was already reeling from dealing with Paul's suicide. In 24 years of marriage, there was never any hint that something like this could be lurking in the background. Paul was an exceptional husband and father. This latest news makes our grieving so much more complicated. We would appreciate being given the space to process and come to terms with this development as we mourn. The difficult position the Hutchinson family has been left in is not lost on law enforcement. I feel sorrow for the Hutchinson family. They were unaware, of course, and in many ways, they are also victims of this man," Sheriff Springer said in an interview with the Montana Free Press. Danny's sister Stephanie spoke at the press conference announcing Hutchinson's identification. While she is happy that her sister's case is finally solved, her celebration over it was short-lived. It's quickly replaced with a tangled mess of frustration, disbelief, and anger, she said. The institutions that are designed to protect the rights of victims, to ensure that vicious killers are incarcerated, to deliver justice in Montana, those institutions failed my sister. Danielle's story should anger you, should make you think about your mothers, your sisters, your wives, and your daughters, should make you think about everything you would do to protect and honor the women you love. While Hutchinson cannot be tried or convicted for what he did to Danny, and therefore will never be incarcerated for his crimes, Stephanie still thinks that her sister finally has justice, after 28 years. In an interview with KBZK News, she said, "I don't condone suicide. I think that if people are hurting, they should get help, but I am really glad that Danny's killer is dead, even if by his own hand. This is justice for my sister, and the idea of him being out there doesn't have to haunt me anymore, and doesn't have to haunt my family, and so this is resolution." Luis Armando Albino was born in Puerto Rico. In the summer of 1950, his mother Antonia moved him and his 5 siblings to Oakland, California. On February 21st, 1951, 6-year-old Luis went to Jefferson Square Park with his 10-year-old brother Roger. While they were there, a woman in her 30s, wearing a green bandana around her head, came up to Luis and began speaking to him in Spanish. She told him that if he came with her to a nearby store, she would buy him some candy. Louise went with her. Roger waited in the park for his little brother to come back, but he never did. Roger then ran home to tell his mother what had happened. A massive search was launched involving the police, soldiers from the Oakland Army base, the Coast Guard, and city employees. Numerous nearby bodies of water were searched in case Louisa's body had ended up in one of them. Roger was interviewed multiple times about the day of the disappearance and the woman in the park. Louisa's mother, Antonia, visited the police station every day in hopes of getting news about her son. As time went on, these visits became weekly, then monthly, then yearly. However, she never gave up hope that her son was alive. She made multiple trips back to Puerto Rico, thinking that perhaps Louise had been taken there. 1966 marked the 15th anniversary of Louisa's disappearance. Rather than be discouraged by this, his family viewed the milestone as a new opportunity for them to find him, as he would now be 21 years old and eligible for military service. They hoped they could find him listed in official selective service records, but they could not. Antonia never wavered in her belief that her son was alive. His photograph was always displayed in her home, and she carried an article about his disappearance with her in her wallet. Even as decades passed, she continued to pray that she would see Louise again before she died. Unfortunately, she never did. She passed away in 2005 at the age of 92. Louise's disappearance was not a family secret, and his nieces and nephews grew up knowing about him. The family's long search for him was a regular topic of conversation. One of his nieces, Alida Aliquin, took a commercial DNA ancestry test in 2020 purely for fun. However, when she received her results, they showed she was a 22% match to a man she had never heard of. She immediately thought that he could be her long-lost Uncle Luis. She sent a message to the man through the site, but did not receive a response. In February of 2024, Alida watched a documentary that featured Puerto Rican folklore and was inspired to more actively pursue the lead she had found in 2020. She and her daughters began researching the name from the DNA match online and at the Oakland Public Library. After finding pictures of a man with that name online and seeing the resemblance he bore to other members of their family, they believed they were on the right track. They went to the police, who in turn contacted the State Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to open a new investigation. The man Alida had matched to on the DNA site was located on the East Coast. He was a father and grandfather. He was also a retired firefighter and a veteran of the Marine Corps who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. The man believed to potentially be Luis provided a sample of his DNA to investigators, as did Alida's mother. On June 20th, 2024, investigators came to Alida's mother's home to tell her that the results of the DNA test had confirmed that her brother Luis had been found. Where on the East Coast he lives and what name he has been living under have not been released, so I will continue to refer to him by his birth name of Luis. Luis was interviewed by the FBI. He has some memories of the kidnapping and being taken to the East Coast, but the adults in his life never answered any of the questions he asked them about those memories. He believed he was the son of the couple who raised him. On June 24th, 2024, Luis arrived in California to reunite with his siblings. When Luis met Alida, he gave her a big hug and thanked her for finding him. The day after he met Alida, she took him to see his brother Roger, the last member of the family to have seen him before he was kidnapped. The brothers shared a long hug and spent a lot of time talking on topics ranging from the day of the abduction to the experiences they each had in the military. Luis's first trip to California in June was short, but he returned in July for a 3-week trip to spend more time with his family. While Luis was not found in time for his mother to see him again, He was found just in time for his brother Roger, who passed away in August of 2024, just weeks after being reunited with his younger brother. Alida was relieved that her uncle was able to see Luis again before he passed away. "I think he died happily," she told the Mercury News. "He was at peace with himself, knowing that his brother was found. I was just so happy I was able to do this for him and bring him closure and peace." Catherine Romer was always the life of the party, with a vivacious personality and a love for spending time with others. She had 1 son and 9 granddaughters, but had a way of making each one of the sisters feel as though they were her favorite granddaughter. She was regularly at her son's home and a major part of her granddaughters' lives, but seeing her always felt like a special occasion to them. When she came over, it still felt as though a celebrity were making an appearance at their home. Catherine loved traveling with her granddaughters and taking them to restaurants to introduce them to new and exciting foods. Catherine was a widow. After her husband's death, she had remained friends with Charles Romer, who had been a friend of her late husband. Charles was the father of 2 sons and a retired Sinclair Oil executive. According to one of Catherine's granddaughters, he was a lovely and generous man. Like Catherine, Charles had outlived his spouse. After years of friendship, Catherine and Charles had gotten married. 76-year-old Catherine and 74-year-old Charles lived in Scarsdale, New York, but were snowbirds. They spent their winters living in an apartment in a motel Charles owned in Miami, Florida. They were very rigid in their travel routine when it came to driving to and from Florida. Every year, they stayed at a Holiday Inn in Brunswick, Georgia, after their first day of the long drive back to New York. Their routine in 1980 was no different. They checked into the Holiday Inn just before 4 p.m. on April 8th. However, they never checked out. 2 days later, a hotel maid found their belongings inside their room, but it appeared that the room had not been slept in. The couple could not be found. There were no signs of foul play in the room. A Georgia Highway Patrol officer reported seeing the couple's car near some restaurants approximately an hour after they checked into their hotel, but no further confirmed sightings were ever reported. Catherine's son, Frank Keller, said in a press interview that he was concerned that his mother and stepfather had been abducted. The couple was wealthy and known to people in the area because they had such a consistent routine when traveling to New York each spring. His mother was reported to have been wearing an estimated $81,000 worth of jewelry at the time she disappeared. The search for the Romers was one of the largest in the history of the state of Georgia, and involved local law enforcement, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Coastal areas in both Georgia and Florida were searched. However, no sign of the couple was found. As years went on without answers, Charles's son, Charles Jr., remained in contact with law enforcement, and Catherine's son Frank made multiple trips to Georgia to continue looking for them. Charles and Catherine were legally declared dead in 1985, 5 years after they went missing, and their $1 million estate was settled. On November 22, 2024, Sunshine State Sonar was working at a pond in Brunswick. The nonprofit group brings together volunteers with specialized skills to perform underwater searches in hopes of locating missing people. The group had come to this particular pond to follow up on a tip that a vehicle may have been submerged in it. They located the vehicle, a 1970s Ford sedan, but then decided to investigate the pond further. In doing so, they located a second vehicle. There was zero visibility in the pond, so divers had to go by feel as they tried to gather information about the vehicle. On one of these dives, a diver reached into the car through an open window and felt something hard. He picked it up and brought it to the surface. It was a human femur. The vehicle was the Romer's 1979 Lincoln Continental, with a custom license plate and monogrammed headrests featuring the couple's initials. Some of their personal items were located in the car. While DNA testing of the bone found in the car will take months to complete, the couple's families have accepted that Catherine and Charles died in the car. The pond is being drained in hopes of finding further evidence or remains. The pond where the car was found lies between the hotel where Charles and Catherine were staying, now called the Royal Inn Hotel, and Interstate 95, a new Jessup highway. The pond had been searched during the initial investigation, although it is unclear how thorough that search was. Based on the proximity of where the car was found to the parking lot, it is possible that the car was accidentally put into reverse and driven into the pond. Sadly, none of Catherine or Charles's sons were alive to learn what had happened to the couple. However, Catherine's granddaughters are grateful that a group of strangers worked so hard to finally get them some answers. Even though it appears Charles and Catherine died in April of 1980, all of the circumstances indicate that they were killed in an accident, which is a relief given the fact that their families have spent decades fearing all possible scenarios, including them being tortured and murdered. Catherine's granddaughters spent Thanksgiving together shortly after the car was found. According to Catherine's granddaughter Christine, the whole family just shared stories about them. It was a happy time because of this resolve we're feeling. It sort of gave us permission to celebrate their lives and talk about the fun memories without the feeling of dread, sorrow, and sadness. In 1983, 20-year-old Paul and 19-year-old Melody Jones were young and in love. The newlyweds lived north of Earlsboro, Oklahoma, down the road from Melody's mother. On May 4th, Melody went fishing with her family and was dropped off at home that evening. Their families would never see Melody or Paul alive again. The following morning, May 5th, Melody did not show up to work at the Dairy Queen in Seminole, Oklahoma. The manager there called Melody's mother, Carol, to see if she knew where Melody was. She did not. Carol therefore went down the road to her daughter's home. When she arrived, she found that the front door was slightly ajar. When she looked inside, she saw her son-in-law Paul's body. Her daughter was nowhere to be found. It was determined that Paul had been murdered. There was no indication that Melody had willingly left home. All of her personal belongings had been left behind. Police believed that Melody had been abducted by whoever killed her husband. Police searched for Melody on foot, by helicopter, and on horseback, but did not find her or any clues related to her disappearance. Over the years, dozens of potential sightings of Melody were called in, but none of them ever proved to be her. The case was formally reopened in 2009. In 2017, a tip came in about a location where Melody's body may have been buried. The sheriff's office conducted a major search, digging in multiple locations on the site, but did not locate anything. On August 7, 2024, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations announced that Melody's remains had been identified. They had actually been found in Seminole County in October of 1998. They had been transported to the office of the Oklahoma Chief Medical Examiner, but no identification of them could be made there at the time. It took until 2024 for the office to receive the resources necessary for them to perform more extensive testing on the remains. Once they were able to perform this testing, the remains were positively identified as those of Melody Jones. 2 weeks after Melody's remains were identified, her family held a funeral for her and laid her to rest. However, their 41-year search for answers is only partially over. We've got closure, but now we need more closure, Melody's brother, Randall Garton, told Fox 25 News. While Melody's disappearance has been solved, whoever murdered her and her husband remains at large. Authorities are continuing their investigation into the murders.